Hello, everyone. Good morning to those who are in different time zone, including our guests, and good evening from Hong Kong. Welcome to the FCC Hong Kong online event, a talk with Vote Rush author Henry Sanderson. I'm Joe Pan, journalist, member governor of the FCC. In these discussions, we will discuss and explore with Mr. Sanderson about his thesis of profiling winners and losers in the race to go green, providing our audience with the essential background knowledge needed to ask critical questions about our transition away from fossil fuels. First, I would like to introduce our guest. Here online with us is Mr. Henry Sanderson, dialing in from the UK time zone. Henry Sanderson covered commodities and mining for the Financial Times for 7 years. He is also the executive editor at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. He previously lived and worked in China from 2007 to 2017, where he was a Beijing-based reporter for Bloomberg News. He tweets at HJE Sanderson and lives in London with his wife and 2 children. Welcome, Henry.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I will start off by asking some questions, and we will go on to open the floor to the folks online, and we'll have hopefully we'll get a really robust Q&A, and by the end, our audience should find out who's the winner and losers in this, if not a list, definitely some hint who are the ones that's losing or winning in this race. The book is not really just about the transition, but also focus on 4 metals important in the battery of electronics and electric vehicles: cobalt, nickel, copper, and lithium. So would like to ask, obviously you put you kind of talked about your timing and circumstance where you start researching for this book at the introductions, but tell us about the inspiration. At what point it becomes a serious project for you? You want to write about this book and writing it and titling it Vote Rush. And so please, let's start with that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I moved back from China to London, started to cover commodities. And when I started, it was sort of the tail end of the China commodities boom, the industrial growth in China that had caused prices for iron ore and copper to go high. And that was ending around 2014. And what I became interested in was how making a transition to a low carbon economy actually will involve more mining, which will involve a lot of raw materials. And it was kind of overlooked, and especially overlooked in discussions about climate change and in climate change talks. And what I found really was that we're looking at a massive industrial effort to build out the clean energy technologies that we need to transition. And when you think about the speed of this energy transition, it has to happen much faster than historical energy transitions. So really, we're going to see a very exponential increase in demand for a lot of these raw materials this decade. And also what I became interested in was the geopolitics of this whole race. And that's why I talk about the winners and losers, because I found that we have these new countries emerging that are becoming very important in this global supply chain. And I can talk about this, but countries like Indonesia or Chile, these are countries with the raw resources that we need, without which we can't make this transition. And then just the geopolitics of China had, in a way, done a lot of the hard work for us in the West, right? In terms of costs of batteries and solar have come down. And now the West has to reindustrialize, has to properly start making these things so that we also can make the transition without relying on one country. So all these forces came together, and that's why I wrote the book, which is to say, when we think of clean energy, let's not just think of a solar panel on a hill or turbine on a hill. We need to think of these supply chains, which are dirty, which are carbon intense, which are geopolitical, and we need to open our eyes, because we need to make this transition with our eyes open. And if we don't, we risk derailing it or delaying it.
Well, you definitely did a lot of research and traveled quite a bit to different countries where those minings and supply chains, you visited manufacturers, and you actually went to the Republic of Congo and look at the actual mining, and you have some paragraphs describing how people are actually mining with their hands and children and women in the deep of the mine. So tell us how did that in the process, how was that you actually visit them before, or when you start the book, you actually go there, and what's the process like?
Yeah, that's right. So I went as part of my work as a journalist and researching the book. And the Democratic Republic of Congo is one of these countries that's becoming more and more important. And we now see that the US quite engaged in the DRC. We've seen the European Union just there recently. And the reason is it produced last year about 70% of the world's cobalt. And cobalt is a critical ingredient in many electric vehicle batteries, as well as in smartphones. So what you have is a case where demand is increasing in the rich world, in the Western world, but the bottom end of the supply chain is feeling the impacts of this. And in the DRC, when you go there, you see that you have these big industrial mines. They're sort of behind big fences. They look like huge little villages, big industrial sites. And then outside the gates, and sometimes inside the gates, you see people just mining by hand in very primitive conditions. And they take their cobalt and copper and they sell it to depots, which are normally run by Chinese traders. And this cobalt enters the global supply chain. And I think what's so fascinating is because the EV is a green product, and in many cases we're paying a premium for an EV, people really care about the supply chain behind an electric vehicle in a way, perhaps we didn't care when it was just smartphones and we just ignored what was going on. But now, because it's a green product, we want these supply chains to be cleaner. But one of the big contradictions is, as we switch to EVs, the people in the DRC are feeling the impact. And in many cases, when prices get higher, they go out to mine by hand, children are involved, and they also don't receive a fair price. So it's one of those awful parts of globalized supply chains. But the good news is we are focusing more on it because of the green energy transition, and it's very hard to solve, but we need to properly engage with the DRC and not act like we did before, where we just offshored not only the supply chains, but offshore the consciousness of these supply chains.
I like how you chapter each of the metal and focus on it, and of course the cobalt is the cobalt problem, and then of course you have the blood cobalt and the nickel. So you walk us through in the order what your book had laid out different metals, and what are they purposely put down on the priority and the importance they play in the EV manufacturing process?
Not really the importance, but I think if you look at electric vehicles, the demand is immense, right? And also for copper, which we need not just for EVs, but for wind turbines, for general electrification. The demand for all of them is really, really strong. Lithium demand could this decade quadruple alone, right? And cobalt demand double. Nickel demand for batteries almost quadruple. So we've got this huge demand increase that we're seeing for all these minerals. Now, a lot does depend on technology and also how consumers choose electric vehicles, which is one of the most fascinating aspects to look at, which is that consumers have a real impact on raw materials. Because if we want, let's say in the US, if you want to buy an electric SUV or electric pickup truck, that battery is going to have a lot of nickel in it and cobalt as well. But if you're just talking about buying a Wuling Mini in China or a small EV, it might not have any nickel and cobalt. So the question now is whether we can have smaller electric vehicles in Europe, in the US. I think the US is doubtful. And what does that do for demand for these minerals? Because that plays a big role. And consumers may not think about it when they're purchasing an electric vehicle, but the battery is a huge part of the vehicle, around 40% of the costs. And all these minerals, depend on which battery you choose. So it's not so much of an importance, but it depends on how technology advances. And we shouldn't rule out innovation, right? We've seen that, constantly when prices are high or when minerals are in short supply, there is always innovation, and we could see that happen as well.
Fantastic. What about the nickel? And you, in the book, you actually talked about one fascinating chapters I went back on is the story how it's almost like a big short or big squeeze on the nickel markets by this very much not well-known Chinese founder of this who reside in Shanghai and all that. So did you personally meet him, or how did you collect all the information around him, or with all the details?
Yeah, I didn't meet him personally. I just interviewed people who had worked closely with him, who had met him. He's a formidable figure in this market. And this is one of the companies I find so fascinating, which is we in the West don't often know that there are these Chinese billionaires or these big Chinese companies that are actually providing the material underpinnings of our supply chains, and especially the move to clean energy. And Tsingshan is one of these companies. You know, it's not listed, it's private company. It's very entrepreneurial, biggest stainless steel producer in the world, but also now making a big move to produce nickel for electric vehicle batteries. And what is so interesting about the company and the story is Indonesia a few years ago, Indonesia is the biggest nickel producer. It banned exports of nickel. It just said, well, we're not exporting nickel anymore. You've got to come to the country and invest in the country. And Tsingshan is one of the companies that really took up this offer, and they built huge processing facilities in Indonesia, industrial park with hotel and its own runway. And what we've seen is China sort of offshoring its heavy industry to Indonesia, but at the same time creating electric vehicle supply chain in Indonesia and making Indonesia a very important country now in the global geopolitics of clean energy. And Indonesia's used its position, its leverage very, very well, you would say, so that now it's got nickel, it's got the processing, it's going to get battery manufacturing in Indonesia and EV manufacturing in Indonesia. So it's an example of a developing country that said, we've got the resources, we're not just going to export raw materials and someone else take the value, we're going to build a whole supply chain in Indonesia. And Tsingshan has been at the forefront of that. Now, the downside is that China's offshored some of the environmental costs, the pollution to Indonesia, right? And now we're seeing the effects of that, the impacts of that. And this is the big balancing act with everything we do with clean energy technologies, is we don't want to create additional pollution, additional carbon, right? That's not our game. So we need to really focus on trying to improve these supply chains.
And for those who haven't read the book, and this is what, that's the story actually was from the chapter 13 nickel, right? And that's the part where Xiang Guangda was the one who actually founded. Tell me, I was reading that particular story and anecdotes. I always wonder, how much did he know in advance and working with the Indonesian governments, and also back end on the other side, on supply side or demand side, working with the Chinese government, and be able to make that kind of a positioning that he did. So was there any view on that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't know for sure, but people do speculate that maybe he knew that this ban was coming, or other bans were coming along, and positioned himself well in Indonesia. I think what's interesting is you saw him get caught out last year in a very interesting drama where nickel prices increased by 250% in 2 days. And that's because he put a massive short position on the market, because he knew all this nickel was coming from Indonesia, but he hadn't anticipated the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which sent nickel prices soaring. So he was caught in a short squeeze. So he is obviously a very formidable person. He likes to take a bet on the market. Unfortunately, last year, that caused him problems. But he's a giant in this industry. And also, I would make the point that without this Chinese investment in Indonesia, we in the West would find it very hard to make a transition to electric vehicles. That's quite important to understand. Tsingshan and others have invested about 15 billion in Indonesia. So, we have these geopolitical tensions at the moment with Europe and the US looking to reduce reliance on China. But at the same time, without this investment, we wouldn't be able to produce electric vehicle batteries with nickel. They have created supply in the market. So this is one of these tensions that I find so interesting, which is, yes, the US and EU want to reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains. That's the political imperative that we're seeing at a very high level now. But at the same time, we haven't seen Western companies invest in supply, right, and actually put dollars into the ground to create the supply to transition to clean energy. So we're very reliant on Chinese supply chains. And yes, we can talk politically about what we want to do, but we need to see dollars in the ground from Western companies. And that's the biggest challenge to the whole geopolitics at the moment.
And I think that's what part of the very unique about the book and telling the story, that otherwise people are just from one point of view, and the geopolitical view is from the West or just from the East. And here you have a supply chain from the ground up, and looking at someone have to invest and actually make that happen. Talking about which on the investment in the company, on the demand side, definitely you talk a lot about Tesla. So can you share with the audience here is about your view and how you profile them and where they are, the winner or loser, or where they are?
Yeah, no, Tesla is one of the winners. I think what's interesting about Tesla is it's always understood the need for scale. And I think scale is something that we have in China. And I think Tesla is one of the few Western companies that understands that to make a meaningful difference to CO2 emissions, to transitioning away from fossil fuels, you have to build scale. And this means huge battery factories, huge supply chains. And Tesla is one of those companies that more than any other automotive company has invested in, giant battery factory in Nevada, which they're expanding. And Elon Musk always talks about scale. And I think that's very impressive understanding that he has, and he's right. Speed and scale are critical for solving climate change. I think on the other hand, Tesla faces difficulties because so much of its supply chain, as I say, a lot of it comes from these Chinese companies. It obviously has its Shanghai gigafactory. So, in some ways, the challenge for Tesla is, again, like other companies, trying to build a US supply chain, a Western supply chain, trying in some senses, I guess, to divide its supply chains into one for the Chinese market, one for the Western market. It could find itself in a tricky position if the politics go against it, where the Chinese market is obviously very important for it, as it is for other automotive companies, but yet the Western market is also important. So yeah, Tesla now needs to build up its own supply chain, which it's doing, which it's exactly it is doing, but it all takes time, right? And I think this is the problem with this transition, is that China's had quite a head start over the West. It's already built, lots of battery factories. Companies like CATL are very, very big, right? 50% of the Chinese market, 30% of the global market. So it's very hard for Tesla and others to catch up. They will, but that's part of the challenge. I would just say another thing that's interesting about Tesla is it's being very cautious about actually investing in the mines itself. And I think this goes back to your discussion of Cobalt. I think it is wary. I think Elon Musk is wary of the ESG implications, the other implications of actually investing in mines and taking on the risk of that. Whereas we've seen General Motors in the US actually invest in a lithium mine in Nevada. So it's a very interesting contrast. And Ford has agreed to go to Indonesia and invest with a Chinese company in nickel in Indonesia. So in some senses, we see Tesla falling behind a bit in terms of actually investing in the mines itself. And this is a sort of the next thing, is how far do automakers go to invest in the mines so they can say to consumers, look, here's the whole supply chain for your vehicle from mine to product.
Interesting. So for Tesla, I mean, your book was published September 2022, right?
Yeah.
And so after that, in the last 12 months or so, what has happened in Tesla? They also look into China, right? The re-entering or doubling down in China. So have you keep up with that? And what do you think that next move for them in battery manufacturing?
Yeah, so Tesla really just has to expand capacity, and they've announced a plant in Mexico. What's interesting is Indonesia wants them to come very, very, very badly, and Jokowi has said, if you come to Indonesia, Tesla, I'll give you a nickel concession for free. but we haven't quite seen confirmation from Tesla. But yeah, Tesla is about just expanding the battery capacity. They're making their own batteries as well, which is not easy, which they're doing. And they're also going to be processing lithium. They're building a lithium refinery in Gulf Coast of Mexico. And this, again, is one small step to reduce China's presence in these supply chains. If you think about lithium, it's quite interesting because Australia is the biggest producer, but almost all of it's processed in China. So you have this mutual dependency between China and Australia that we have for iron ore as well, right? Australia sends all its iron ore to China, and it also sends all of its lithium. Now, what we're going to see is lithium from Australia could go straight to Tesla's refinery in the US or one in Europe. So we're going to see these supply chains diverge, as I say, where we're going to see one China-focused supply chain and then this new Western supply chain or ally supply chain, which is being created and really supported at a political level, where you've got Canada, Australia, Europe, the US really trying to, Japan, Korea, trying to produce new supply chains.
Thank you. At this point, I would like to remind those who are online, would like to ask any question, please send them to question@fcchk.org. And that's question, a singular question, @fcchk.org. So let's continue. What surprised you the most during this process of producing this book?
Yeah, what surprised me the most, actually, it's interesting, is how much more of a big topic it's become. I never expected when I started writing it. You always write in isolation and in a certain degree of solitude, right? And I didn't expect that, this year we would see, the geopolitical is one of the geopolitical priorities, right, for Europe and the US to actually build out these supply chains. We've had the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which is a huge surprise to me, because I grew up, like many people, thinking the US would never do anything on climate, that Congress could, never get anything passed. And we saw, the disappointments of the Obama era. But then we see the US just quite quickly come out with this massive piece of legislation that really changes the game on so many levels. It's kind of extraordinary still to this day. People are talking about, the trillion or the amount of money that could potentially be spent. It's an extraordinary, how do you say it? The West, Europe and US has woken up to China's dominance in this way. And on the flip side, China has woken up Europe and the US, and that is not ideal for China either, because, as I say, their companies are very dominant in this supply chain, and now they face real pushback, real concerted effort by Europe and the US. And that I hadn't really anticipated when I was writing this book, the degree to which it's become such a priority. I think in Europe, very much the invasion of Ukraine has focused minds to an extraordinary extent to let's accelerate this transition to renewable energy. Let's not be reliant on one country for supply. If you think of certain minerals such as graphite, China supplies almost 100% of graphite, according to data from Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Things like magnesium is almost 100% comes from China. So, these concerns have really come to the forefront. In the US, I think what's so interesting is they could never coalesce around dealing with climate change or cap and trade bill or any of these things. But now what we see is coalescence around combating China, around providing jobs and clean energy. And we've seen this whole political shift, I think. I mean, I don't know if it will last. I hope it will, where that's actually made it possible to accelerate clean energy in the US in a way that perhaps it wasn't before. So these changes, I think, in the West have been huge and quite remarkable.
Well, we can't go on talk about the changes without mentioning the recent passing of the European the greenwashings and other things that's the regulations. So let's talk about that. What's your view, and did you mention anything for our audience in the book?
Yeah. So what's so interesting is the EU has come out with a lot of recent initiatives, but one of them, or a couple of them, what they're trying to do is by 2030, Europe wants to produce 40% of its own clean energy technologies, so solar, wind, batteries. If you think about it, China produces 80% of the world's batteries at the moment, 90% of the solar supply chains in China. And then Europe wants to mine about 10% of its own demand, process about 40%, so much higher than the mining. So Europe's really trying to encourage a move to support its industry. What's interesting is the 10% mining is quite low, right? So I think Europe realizes how difficult it is to open new mines in Europe. No one wants a mine in their backyard. Even if you say, look, this is a lithium mine going to electric vehicles, people say we don't care. So that's a very low target. 10% of the raw materials will come from within the EU by 2030. It's probably about 1% now. But the 40% is quite high. So the question is, how does Europe achieve it? And European Union, being what it is, it can't do things like the US has done with the Inflation Reduction Act. It's got different member states. It's got rules on state aid. So that's the issue for Europe. How can it actually get money out the door to support these industries? How can it reduce permitting time? Because it's not just mines people don't want to live next to. They don't want to live next to solar panels or wind turbines, right? Or any other things. So it has to try and achieve this while being a block of many countries, right? And trying to achieve it not only at the EU level, but at the national level as well. I think the US is in a good situation because it's got lower energy costs at the moment, and it can unveil something like the Inflation Reduction Act, where they have these very generous production tax credits. So if you were going to go build batteries in the US, you get paid a very tax credit, a very generous tax credit. So that's something the EU can't match, apples for apples, but that's but they want to do what they can, right? And I think the biggest fear at the moment, the biggest fear in Europe and elsewhere, is that we see a race to the bottom where everyone's trying to subsidize their own industries, and we see uncompetitive practices or taxpayer money wasted, and this is the big concern at the moment. But on the other hand, what's quite good about this moment is the realization that, well, how else do you compete with China without industrial policy, without doing some of what China did itself? You can't just sit back and say, let the market work, or the market hasn't worked, right? Why have you got 90% of solar supply chain in China, or 100% of graphite? That can't be a good situation. So in some ways it's refreshing that this change in attitudes come about, to realize what this game is about and how you have to win this race.
So we talked a lot about the cobalt at the beginning, and the anecdote from the Chinese player on the nickel. Tell us about copper and lithium. So on that part, what was some of the anecdotes worth mentioning to our audience?
So as you sit in your electric vehicle, lithium and copper are very important minerals in your EV. EVs use much more copper than normal vehicles, because the electric motors, the wiring, etc. And then you think about the copper in the charging cable. Then you need copper for wind turbines, etc. Just to upgrade the whole grid, we need copper. And copper mines, I guess one of the things I really came to realize is the giant scale of these huge copper mines. When I went to visit a copper mine in Chile, it's just a huge hole in the earth. It's been mined for 100 years or so, and it's still going. And these are big facilities, and you're only getting 2% or so of copper in the rock, so a lot of waste rock produced, but they're very hard to find. The story I tell in the book is about Robert Friedland, who's a billionaire miner. He discovered, he's responsible for discovering some of the only new copper mines, and he went to the DRC in the late 90s, and his mine only started a few years ago. So it takes a long time to discover a new copper mine, and the easy mines have been discovered already, right? So we as a global economy are going to rely more and more on more difficult jurisdictions, and it's just super hard to find new copper. So, and also China is very reliant on imports of copper. It's one of those commodities where it's quite strategically vulnerable. It doesn't have, huge domestic deposits. So I'd say copper, people are saying it's the new oil. It is one of those critical minerals. In lithium, it's different because lithium is actually quite abundant. There's lithium in everywhere and in seawater. What it is a case of it being a small market that needs to grow to a massive market. And we need actual investment in the mining and the processing of the lithium. And that's the issue at the moment, which is how do we get this investment into the ground, into the facilities? And that's the issue with lithium. And as I say, lithium demand will quadruple this decade. Lithium's hard to replace in a battery, not impossible, because we have sodium ion batteries coming, but it is quite hard. So, lithium is a really interesting market because you've got Australia, you've got Chile, you've got Argentina, yet demand is rapidly increasing. So yeah, those two minerals I think are really key.
You also have a chapter on the final frontier, mining in the deep sea, and tell us about it. How did that come about, and how is it related to the future?
Yeah, so it's topical at the moment because they're having the meeting at the moment at the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica. So this is one of these UN bodies that probably no one's ever heard about, but they are in charge with regulating deep sea mining, and they have to come up with the regulations under which deep sea mining will take place commercially for the first time, or pretty much the first time. And this is all governed by the UN Law of the Sea document. So it's very it's hard to know whether these regulations will come out, but it's quite complicated. All these countries have to agree under what conditions we can start to mine the deep sea. And yet scientists, say that we need much more research about the life down there, because, people think of the deep sea as being lifeless, but it's actually full of life and species. And just there's this sense that, are we crossing a red line here? Are we firing a starting gun on something that we won't be able to control, especially in this environment of geopolitical tension and hostility? Once we started it, what's going to happen, right? Can we go back? Do we need to mine the deep sea when we've got these mineral deposits on land? But at the moment, I think the problem is that it arouses a lot of hostility in some people, right? And it's sometimes hard to see how much car makers or consumers would like this to go ahead, right? Because we've already destroyed so much of our ecosystem. We have a biodiversity crisis. Do we really want to open up another frontier to extraction? It's also very hard to say, oh, it's better than mining on land, because mining on land is not going to stop if we do deep sea mining. But I think it's one of those things to watch, and we have to see how it develops. But for sure, China's interested, Japan's interested, many people are interested in it.
So in the process of writing it and researching, you see the governments and the geopolitical forces at play. And what are the predictions you would say? Like, for example, deep sea mining, and China definitely took the interest, and others. Would there be countries like Indonesia where they would introduce regulations like other things that's be able to corner the market at some point, even though it's deep sea, but it still belongs to some sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a good point. So the deep sea mining, the International Seabed Authority controls is in international waters, right? That's their remit. But if you have waters within 200 nautical miles off the coast, which are national waters. So obviously you could have deep sea mining there without the need for all these regulations. So that that could potentially happen as well. So we have to wait and see. I think Japan's interested in that, but I think part of the problem with the regulations is according to the law of the sea, countries that mine at the moment shouldn't be disadvantaged by deep sea mining. So I think you have to see very complicated regulation where they have to be compensated, or somehow we have mechanisms where countries who lose out potential mining revenue will be compensated. So that's part of the issue with the regulation. The other thing is the US hasn't ratified the law of the sea, so are they at a disadvantage there as well? So that's interesting to watch. But yeah, we have to see how it's going to develop. But I do think what we probably need is more study, more scientific study. And you have a situation where a lot of these deep sea mining companies are sponsoring the science, are paying for the science, but we obviously need to make sure that's independent and not sort of guided by the money. So yeah, all these concerns. But yeah, how do I see things developing? I think what we're seeing at the moment is just the heavy weight of geopolitics across all these markets, where we see countries like Indonesia use their nickel, but then the EU took them to WTO to complain. So we're seeing we're really devolving into quite a different era where countries and regions are using trade and subsidies as weapons, and all trying to increase their presence in this supply chain, right? So I think it's going to be quite a complicated era.
So talking about the supply chains, there's obviously there's the carbon footprint calculations is a big part of it. Every company under pressure to reduce their carbon footprint, but there's the scope 3, the big supply chain. This is the big part, and kind of an elephant in the room in a way. Someone, if they don't, doesn't belong to them, they don't really need to care about it. But at some point, how is it going to be accounted for? And for EVs of the world, where consumer care about it, how do you address that? And or have you talked and actually covered that in the book?
Yeah, so in the book I cover a bit about it, but yeah, what we're seeing is that you're exactly right. Companies need to take into account the emissions of the supply chain. The issue is that even in the lithium sector or some of these minerals, there's not enough disclosure of the carbon footprint. Only a small number of companies actually disclose all these details. So when you see a lot of carbon calculations about producing a battery or producing these materials, they're often based on estimates or best guess estimates. So something like graphite, the supply chain is quite opaque in China. So we really need we need more transparency, more disclosure. If you think about it, the automotive companies have, many of them promised to have net zero targets or net zero cars. So we need to see greater transparency, and I think this is coming. The EU is talking about a battery passport, where you have all these details, where you have a virtual copy of an electric vehicle battery, right, that has the carbon footprint, etc., where the materials come from. I think that's a really interesting idea, and it's quite interesting also because if the EU says this, it's a big market, right? So we have a lot of leverage in the EU to force change throughout the whole supply chain. And I think Chinese companies are worried that, well, are we going to get cut out of the European market, right? If we don't reach these sustainability standards. So it is driving a big change throughout the whole supply chain. And I think this is a good thing. We need to see more transparency. Because the problem is, in many cases now, is that producing electric vehicle can be more carbon intensive than producing internal combustion engine. And so we need to see that come down, right? So that you get, much lower carbon footprint from day one. And then obviously you charge your car with renewable energy. So that's the way we need to lower the whole carbon footprint. There is one important point to mention about all this, which is, I don't know if many of you driven electric vehicles, but they're much more efficient. So we're not wasting as much energy as internal combustion cars. So that's a huge advantage, just the efficiency angle in itself. So yeah, that's one thing that's really on the side of clean energy and electric vehicles.
Thank you. for those who are on the online, if you have any question, please send them to questions, singular questions at fcchk.org. And so we'll be happy to post the questions for you. Meanwhile, of course, talking about greenwashing, I mean, this is a big thing, all government, all regulators and consumer and advocacies watching with hot eyes. And so what's some of the things that the whole industry, the EV or the mining industry are encountering right now?
I think it's a huge issue, greenwashing, and we've seen the EU release rules recently, and I think nobody's particularly happy about them, but it is a step forward. I think the biggest issue is greenwashing away problems like the cobalt in the DRC. Are you actually going there and monitoring and helping? We want to see less sort of language about audits and this and that, and actual progress on the ground, right? More concrete steps. The same is true for the carbon emissions in this supply chain, right? We need to see concrete data and transparency. I think we've all seen some bad examples of greenwashing, right, with offsetting. And what is interesting is we're seeing mining companies move into offsetting or nature-based offsets. So I think we don't want to see too much of that, right? The energy and attention should be on decarbonizing the supply chain, not trying to offset carbon emissions. So that again is a risk.
Well, they're talking about new energy or technology and other things you also mentioned, and maybe just very briefly, hydrogen kind of field. And so tell us about that and what's some of the things potentially you will be covering or talked about.
Yeah. So hydrogen, I think, has its role. I think if you look at tackling climate change or tackling carbon emissions, we need every technology, but we need to use the ones that are already at scale and are cheap first and foremost. And I think batteries are in that position. So I do think, trying to have hydrogen cars now, I think is a waste of time and waste of energy. And waste of energy is the phrase because it's less efficient, right? You've got to, if you think of, let's say we generate hydrogen from solar power or wind power, you lose energy in that process, and then you lose it again when you're using the hydrogen to power the vehicle. Whereas you just charge a vehicle straight from solar energy or wind energy is much less, the round trip efficiency is much better. And batteries are at big scale now. We're tracking over 300 gigafactories around the world. It's just extraordinary scale, right? And solar and wind as well, the same thing. So we need to move forward and try to electrify what we can. But hydrogen could be useful for longer distance trucking, longer distance vehicles, where the weight of the batteries at a certain point is too much, right? And also charging these massive batteries. So definitely hydrogen can play a role there. It can also play a role in industry, obviously in steel and things like that. That's what we need hydrogen for. But we do need to have green hydrogen. We do, to your point on greenwashing, what we don't want to see is fossil fuel industry using hydrogen as a way to keep going or trying to have hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. We need to see green hydrogen. It's interesting what China's doing. China's also investing in hydrogen. So it is definitely part of the solution. And obviously you can use surplus renewable electricity to create hydrogen. So there are many benefits to it, and we will need to see hydrogen. But I think let's just concentrate on the technology we have at scale now, batteries, solar, wind, to decarbonize as much as possible, and they can get us a long way. So that, I think, is very, very important. But yes, we will see hydrogen, or we will need hydrogen. So that's something to keep an eye on.
You actually mentioned the oil and gas company, and that's my next question. What's the rise of EV will have an impact on them? And obviously a lot of them actually
Yeah.
diversing their portfolio and trying to work on something. And
Yeah.
I was quite surprised if you remember that at one point there's a survey out that the highest ranking ESG company actually was one of the oil company. It's
Yes.
like oxymoron, but at the same time, what
Yeah.
exactly do you think that would have an impact on them? What's their future?
Yeah, so the oil and gas companies, they've all just reported record profits. So it's hard to talk about, the demise of the industry. They're all doing, all done spectacularly well, right? And oil and gas is not going to go away tomorrow. So the question is, how do they invest in this area, this sector, as you say, diversify, or do they just focus on what they're doing until demand eventually goes away? But I think what's quite interesting is, so Saudi Arabia, is taking more of an interest in electric vehicles and the supply chain, and they're actually looking at building processing facilities or looking at mining in Saudi Arabia, and obviously investing in clean energy as well. And they're also going to be the lowest cost oil producer and lowest actually CO2 oil producer. So, when we talk about winners and losers, it's not always what we think. And for the other oil companies, what's quite interesting is, if you look at electric vehicle battery, there's graphite and synthetic graphite, and that actually comes from oil feedstock. So they could play a role in that supply chain. It comes from oil refineries. So that's something they could also invest in. Charging is a big thing that they're investing in. Just near me is a Shell electric vehicle charger, and we've seen BP invest in that as well. So obviously charging, they've got the infrastructure already, right? The forecourt, so they're massively investing in charging. But what I think is, what we've seen, I think, is a slight step backwards from them investing in renewables and just saying, we've got to focus on our core oil and gas. There does seem to be a bit of a change in approach, but I do think they do have a role to play. They could invest in these areas. If you think of the capital they have, they've got, they made these enormous profits. Why not invest some of it in clean energy? And historically, what's so interesting is all the oil companies did play a role. In my book, I tell the story about how ExxonMobil in the 70s pioneered the lithium-ion battery. It actually was investing in solar as well as climate research as well at the time. And we later saw BP and Shell go into solar. So they have a history of clean energy, which is quite interesting.
Interesting. At the end, you definitely end the book in very hopeful notes, right? Talking about the Cornwall mining revival, and then you talk about the children's who are actually doing the electric car race. But one thing you pointed out is the education level, the awareness of renewable energies and EV is higher than ever. So in some ways, education and the awareness is really the key in changing behavior. So tell us about how you arrive at that hopeful note.
Yeah, because I do think, we are moving to a better world. And I do think what's key to say is that, clean energy will save us money. Hopefully, as I say, it's more energy efficient, less wasted energy. It should be cheaper. Eventually, it will also help countries become more energy independent, right? And we've already seen that in the EU, reducing reliance on Russian gas. So it is hopeful. I do think the headlines, yes, are depressing about emissions, keep going up. So little progress from climate change talks, etc. We've got this narrow window of opportunity to take action. But what I do think is hopeful is that things like electric vehicles are at a position now where they really work for most people. And we need to see the price come down. But it's been 100-year-long effort, but finally they're at a place where they work for most families. The infrastructure is now in place, so we just need to deploy and lower the price. So it's quite exciting to me that in London we've seen huge number of EVs now on the roads. So the transition is really happening in front of our eyes, and that's that's what I think is exciting, is the speed at which potentially we can move, right? The speed at which we can move, I think, is exciting. It's just exciting to see consumers embracing these products. We're also going to see a huge shift in young people. Do they want to drive? Do we rethink mobility as part of this energy transition? Is something I find really interesting. Are we going to change the way we get around? That I think is so key to see. Young people aren't learning to drive at nearly the rate of previous generations. So what are we going to see? And how's that going to impact how we get around? We see lots of electric bikes here in London. There are lots of ways to move around, to decarbonize. So that's also very, very exciting. I think the worst thing we could do is just buy SUVs, electric SUVs, or just replicate the same system. So that's also a huge opportunity to rethink mobility.
So you start with your book where you talk about China. You can see from when you were in Beijing, you can see a massive parking lot. So, but at the end, it's also you just talk about reductions of the actual vehicle on the road and using alternative transportation mode. But you see China now being the pioneer, or not, at least the early adapter in the EV. What would you expect when you go back, or if you're going to visit China? Yeah.
Well, I think the air pollution is better in Beijing than it was, when I was there. And I think I'm excited to go back to China just to see. I think now the number of EVs, when I was there, we didn't really see that many EVs, even though BYD have been going for a long time, right? For a very long time. But now I think what's exciting in China is you've got all these Chinese EV companies. You've got a price war going on. It's going to be interesting to see how many survive, how many don't. But it seems like, it's a very exciting market in China at the moment. And I think what the big question is, are EV sales going to continue at the rate they did last year, which was very, 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 very fast, and what's going to happen to consumer preferences, consumer choices, etc. And can these Chinese brands also succeed globally? That's something I'm really interested in. BYD is going to start selling EVs in UK soon, so that's really interesting. Can consumers in the West, how will they think buying Chinese EVs? That's something we're already seeing, and we're going to see more of. So this is really a test, I guess, also for Xi Jinping's vision, right? Can China create the high value global brands, high value manufacturing? Can they succeed globally? And can they succeed at a time when there's obviously big pushback from US and Europe? So that's going to be really interesting for me to watch.
Fantastic. Well, with that, I want to wrap it up. And what are some of the things you see is on the electric vehicles, on if any major breakthrough? What are some of the exciting technology now in line?
Yeah, so there's a lot of excitement about sodium ion, because sodium is very abundant. It's basically table salt, right? So sodium ion batteries could be a solution to everything I talk about in my book, reliance on lithium and these other minerals. So sodium ion is really exciting. But again, it comes back to what kind of cars we're willing to drive. Sodium ion is not, the energy density is not as much as lithium ion. So what kind of vehicles can it power? What kind of role can it play? But that's an example of innovation coming through quite quickly to resolve some of the material issues that we're facing with this transition. So that, I think, is really exciting. And at the end of the day, what we want is technologies that are based on the most abundant materials in the earth, ones that already have big supply chains, one that don't have huge carbon footprint, etc. So that's the route, and then we move to recycling those products. But that's the way to avoid unnecessary carbon emissions of this transition.
What is your next project?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm not sure yet. So yeah, watch this space. I have to keep you updated.
Thank you. So for those who want to get the book, and they're definitely available, we'll keep a copy here in FCC for you as well. And when you do come to visit Hong
Yes.
Kong, actually, you said
Yes, I'd love to.
you lived in Hong Kong before, so we'll love to have you the autograph and put it on our shelf. So
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time. And until next time, we'll see you then. See you online.
Thank you. Thank you very much.